Hello, this is Dr. Bill Barter, and I'm really glad that you're here watching this video about Safe Church. We're going to talk mainly about child safety, but we are also going to address the issue of safety of seniors in our congregations. This is very important work that we do, and it is very important that we keep people safe and that we always remember that it is our primary job in church, particularly when vulnerable people are present, that we be well trained and vigilant about their safety. Whenever you're part of a training or a team, there are norms that are important to keep in mind. For example, participation should be encouraged, but no one should be required to speak. A lot of people are introverts, and speaking is not necessarily how they always communicate. They may be in a group for an hour or two and never say a word, and yet fully participate and benefit from the group. If you speak, be mindful of others so that they have time to speak. Listen to all opinions with respect, and don't be afraid to ask questions. If you've experienced child abuse or elder abuse, for that matter, if you're strongly having strong feelings about that, you are encouraged to address this with a professional, but it's really not safe or appropriate to bring those things up in a group setting, such as a training session. And if the material that we're talking about today becomes uncomfortable, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Get a cup of coffee, use the restroom, or just take a deep breath. It's really not that bad, but we do have to talk about some serious stuff. I'm a firm believer in humor, the ability to laugh at things without laughing at other people. We also have to trust one another to do the right thing if we're going to work together. And we have to be kind toward one another. And we make mistakes, and if we don't learn from mistakes, then the mistakes are really tragic. So take a risk of being wrong once in a while and see what you learn. Don't be afraid to speak your mind with others. And be authentic. Be yourself. Whether you're a child or an adult, there is always the temptation of the peer group. Be cautious about that. Safety is a chief concern of everything we do, and that is about maintaining boundaries around your personal well-being, and those boundaries are physical and emotional, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Be compassionate. Hopefully that's why we do the work that we do. Respect everybody and honor diversity. There are many different types of people, and that's the way God created us. Let's talk about boundaries for a moment. Boundaries help other people know how to treat you. They define your sense of self. They delineate how much you give to other people, and they're dividing lines between you and everyone else that represents a physical and an emotional limit that others cannot violate. Now, let me just say here that boundaries are not walls. It's not the same thing. Boundaries are flexible. So there are limits in relationships, and it may vary depending on the type of relationship you're having. My relationship with my spouse or my child may have different boundaries than my relationship with a member of my congregation. In fact, it probably should. Boundaries help us to separate our needs, wants, desires, and thoughts and feelings from others, and they keep everyone safe and equal. What are boundaries? Boundaries are fundamental structures that establish and preserve identity. Boundaries protect the essential nature of things, and they also contribute to the definition of things. I think of a garden that we have in our yard right now, and my spouse is working very, very diligently on putting in boundaries, whether they be natural hedges or rows of rocks and stone, to separate certain types of plants from others. And it's not my thing, but I have to say it works really well. Boundaries are psychological, spiritual, institutional, and physical. Let's talk about the psychological, and you're going to get a lesson in Freudian psychology here for a moment. We're hopefully gifted with a healthy ego self. and this develops over the life course. And in clinical psychology, you sometimes hear the term intrapsychic, so internal psychic functioning. The healthy ego self maintains an identity, and the identity may be in relationship to the other person, but in a healthy relationship, the other does not replace or detract from the healthy ego self. So boundaries protect the inner self from being dissipated or diffused by the other person. Boundaries don't eliminate relationships, but they keep them in perspective. So here's a psychological example in working with youth. So Chris is a teacher feeling anxious about a significant marital argument that's making her feel insecure about the future of her relationship. When Debbie arrives for confirmation class, Chris decides that she's going to share her anxiety with Debbie before the meeting and tell her why she's anxious, so that Debbie can be aware of the reasons why Chris might be distracted during the class. Whose psychological boundaries are being breached in that scenario, and in what way? And what is the risk? Well, certainly Debbie's boundaries are being breached. But one question for us to ask is, can you breach or break your own boundaries? And the answer to that is yes. So both people in that scenario are having their boundaries violated by the youth minister. What's the risk? We don't want to reverse roles with children. We have a particular role in children's lives as their teachers, as their protectors, as their mentors, as their pastors, as their coaches, whatever our relationship is, and we don't want to sacrifice that relationship by making it fuzzy and irresponsible. The ministry can be impacted negatively, and the well-being of the student. Imagine being a 12 or 13-year-old and getting that information from an adult. And what that does to the student is put them in a caregiver role, which is not appropriate for them, and we don't want to do that. And the well-being of the teacher, is Chris getting her needs met in that scenario? Of course not. Chris needs to get help somewhere else. And would the scenario be any more benign if this were a general Facebook post by Chris and not a direct statement to Debbie? And here's the million-dollar question, folks. Should Debbie be a Facebook friend of an adult confirmation teacher? Now, I would say that Debbie and Chris probably should not be friends on personal Facebook pages, but there might be a way for them to interact on a church Facebook page or a church-related Facebook page, or Chris might create a confirmation class Facebook page, and I think that would be all right. Let's move on. Boundaries are spiritual. In the service of self-determination, humans have a right to explore, question, celebrate, and express their spiritual selves. In general, the spiritual includes a sense of connection to something bigger than we are. It typically involves a search for meaning in life. As such, it's a universal human experience, and it can be quite personal as well. Spiritual boundaries protect the self from manipulation, shame, and coercion, and they allow the self to express spirituality in safety. Here's an example. Deacon Jim is called to the hospital to see Tommy, who is a young adult who has had a car accident and is awaiting surgery. Jim is there because Tommy's mother called. While Tommy appreciates the visit, he makes it clear he does not want to pray. We don't know why, but he does not want to pray. Deacon Jim tells Tommy that perhaps they should pray to help his mother feel better. Tommy gives in, he acquiesces, and he lies uncomfortably silent while Deacon Jim says some prayers before leaving. As he leaves, he tells Tommy that he and the church will be holding him in prayer. How are the spiritual boundaries being treated in this scenario? Well, they're not really being treated at all. They're being trampled over by Deacon Jim. And whose needs are getting met? Well, certainly Deacon Jim is meeting his own needs at the expense of Tommy, and perhaps Deacon Jim is meeting Mom's needs at the expense of Tommy as well. What do you suppose Deacon Jim fears will happen if he doesn't pray over Tommy? I guess you can answer that for yourselves. And what vulnerabilities are being exploited? Well, Tommy's in the hospital for one thing. He's lying in a hospital bed preparing for surgery. He may be on pain medication, on an IV, and so he's quite vulnerable at that moment. Would the scenario change if Deacon Jim just sent a blanket email to the parish requesting prayers for Tommy? Well, this raises privacy issues. He does not have a right to do that. He would only do that if Tommy specifically asked him to do that. And that the same goes with bringing up Tommy at worship on Sunday if Tommy doesn't want that to happen. Tommy has a right to talk about who prays with him or over him or with him. Here's another way this could have gone. Deacon Jim is called to the hospital to see Tommy, who's had a car accident. He's there because Tommy's mother called. Tommy appreciates the visit, makes it clear he doesn't want to pray, and Deacon Jim wishes Tommy a speedy recovery and assures Tommy that the church will help in any way they can if Tommy needs something, and then Deacon Jim leaves. That's a lot better because he's respecting Tommy's needs. And you know, there may be something that the church could do for Tommy that Deacon Jim isn't thinking of. Imagine if Tommy looked up at Deacon Jim and said, you know, I have been worried all day about my cat. I don't have any friends that live nearby that could stop in and feed my cat. Do you suppose there are any cat lovers in the church who live near me who could stop in and give the cat some food and change the litter and scratch my kitty behind the ears? And in that way, the church might be doing more for Tommy than they could have imagined. Boundaries are institutional, so depending on the setting, there are norms for boundaries. For example, a physician performing an exam on one of us could cross boundaries that can't be crossed by a daycare provider working with children. Institutional boundaries protect the self from exploitation. Well-functioning institutions have a clear sense of boundaries that govern the interactions that occur in those settings. So here's an institutional example. There's a culture in the Sunday school program that all children must share every week in class in order to be advanced in the program. Children who don't share are not considered participants, and they're sometimes openly teased by the teachers for their shyness. What's wrong with this picture? And what would be a good institutional boundary? We should never force children to speak. It's just not done. We have a third of our population who are introverts, which means that they process things internally. Children sitting in a group, teenagers sitting in a group, can be fully participating even if they're not speaking. A good institutional boundary might be to begin every group by saying to the group, even when you're not speaking, we will presume that you're participating. You can share if you like, but no one will be forced to share. And lastly, but very importantly, boundaries are physical. In a real sense, psychological, spiritual, and institutional boundaries are expressed and protected in the physical realm. More often than not, the protection or violation of a boundary is embodied in the physical. Therefore, physical boundaries are meaningful and essential in order for the self to be secure. I often refer to the physical boundaries as the firewall. It's really the last place that gets crossed in most boundary violations in churches. Here's a physical example. It's time for the passing of the peace. For the sake of visitors, Pastor Robert announces, the people of Third Lutheran are all huggers. Brace yourselves. The peace of the Lord be always with you. And a cringe-worthy hug fest ensues. What are the boundary violations? Does everyone like to hug? Is everyone comfortable being hugged? Does everyone feel safe being hugged? And do you know the history of everyone in that congregation and why hugging may be problematic for a few people? Whose boundaries are being crossed? I would say the whole church. You might have different answers. And what is institutionally and interpersonally unsafe about this practice? We just don't know everyone's story. And to hug somebody who has been abused and has not recovered from that, or even if they have recovered from it and emerged from that abuse, unable to enjoy that sort of physical contact, we have to be very careful. Who owns boundaries and who protects boundaries? Those are two really good questions for us. Well, we all own our own boundaries, hopefully. But who protects boundaries? Well, when we're working with kids and with seniors and other vulnerable people, we protect boundaries. Sometimes kids can't protect their own boundaries. They're too young, or they're too vulnerable, or somebody has too much power over them. What is the difference between a boundary and a barrier? We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. So a boundary is flexible. I can let somebody into the boundaries that I have around me, but it's my choice. It's not a barrier. Hopefully you're not putting a wall up around yourself that never allows anyone in, but you just have to be careful. Why is it important for there to be good boundaries in the church? Well, you only need to look at the newspapers and listen to the news stories to see what happens in the church when boundaries get crossed in a very extreme way. But good boundaries in church help everyone to feel safe. Good boundaries in church make the church work well, and that's what we want. Jesus taught examples of how to be setting boundaries. He went off to pray by himself, hung out with friends during his time off, was not always nice to people when they crossed his boundaries, by the way. He took a firm stance about bad behavior, and he kept relationships in perspective. And that's throughout the Gospels. Boundaries are dividing lines between you and everyone else and presents physical and emotional limits that others can't violate. It models personal safety, ensures consistency, keeps your role with the people you're working with very clear, and it teaches personal and social responsibility. Boundaries separate your needs, wants, desires, thoughts, and feelings from those of others. So you make sure that only healthy needs are met. Be cautious when you're working with children, what you share with them. Don't confuse their needs with your needs or your needs with their needs. You know, when I hear somebody say to a child, "You look like you need a hug," I think what that adult is saying is that they need a hug, and they need to find that hug somewhere else. Avoid projecting that stuff onto kids. And it's okay to have an unspoken thought. Some things may come to your mind, and you just need to step back and think about it before you say it. Otherwise, you may violate a boundary. Boundaries keep everyone safe and equal. The same rules have to apply to everyone. Favoritism can be damaging. And when there's a prevailing culture of safety, everyone is safe. And I cannot stress this next point enough. When exceptions are made, no one is safe. When I have been involved in child sex abuse cases, 9 times out of 10, those churches have had model church policies. The policies are not the problem, but somebody, a pastor, a youth minister, a teacher, somebody made an exception and someone got hurt. Now here's some clinical terms for you. This one's pronounced ew, and this one's pronounced ick. And I put ew and ick into the slides to remind you that if you see something, say something. If something creeps you out, something that someone has just said to a young person, something that they have done to a young person, somebody who's hugging a little inappropriately, somebody who has made an inappropriate dirty joke with a kid, that should set off bells and whistles inside your gut somewhere, and you should say something about it. Trust the ew and the ick inside of you. Now we're going to take a little quiz about child maltreatment. Just see what you know. 32% of child abuse and neglect victims are under the age of 4. True or false? That is true. The reason it's true is that these children are much more vulnerable. Think of babies. The vast majority of kids who come into the clinic where I work are babies. The babies are abused at a much higher rate than any other children because they're so vulnerable. They may not be fed. They may have broken bones that babies should not even be able to have. And we know they're inflicted injuries. So there's all kinds of reasons why young children are vulnerable. And children under the age of 4 don't have the language skills to report abuse very reliably. Girls are more likely to experience sexual abuse than boys. That is actually true. Not as true today as it used to be, depending on the data you use, but it is still true. Women and girls are less safe in society than men and boys. And if you're not sure about that, ask a group of boys and men what they do in the course of a day to avoid being sexually assaulted. You're not going to hear much. But ask that of a group of girls or women, and you'll get a lot of answers. Hispanic children have the lowest prevalence of child abuse in the United States. That is false. There's no culture that is more abusive than any other. A child living with his or her parent and the live-in partner is 8 times, that should probably say up to 8 times more likely to experience child abuse and neglect than a child living with both birth parents. That's actually true. The vast majority of infants who are injured by a male step-parent, not always, but most often. And step-parents can be risky depending on their background and whether or not the biological parent can protect the child. Homosexuals are more likely to sexually abuse children than heterosexuals, in other words, gay versus straight, and that is false. The highest prevalence of abuse is among heterosexual men, but anyone can sexually abuse a child. Women, gay people, straight people, anyone can sexually abuse a child, but actually among gay men, the number is pretty low. Unemployed parents are more likely to abuse their children than our employed parents. It's true. This doesn't necessarily mean socioeconomic class. So what does it mean? Well, an unemployed investment banker and an unemployed sanitation worker are equally at increased risk for abusing their children. It's the stress of the unemployment, we think, that causes this. In church settings, clergy, like pastors and deacons, are more likely to abuse children than non-clergy or deacons. False. No one occupation makes for higher risk of offending. More than half of all child abuse reports come from the victim's parents. False. Barely 1/4 of all reports come from parents, with schools and hospitals and mental health centers making the reports, churches as well. Why is that? Well, in the vast majority of child abuse cases, one of the perpetrators is a parent. 1 in every 58 children in America were abused last year. That's true. And child abuse deaths are actually up in a recent study. Did you get them all right? Okay, let's move on. Types of child abuse and neglect. Physical abuse, hitting a child, burning or cutting a child, depriving a child of nutrition on purpose, restraining a child, tying them down, or making a child sick on purpose to punish them or to put yourself into the caregiver role with the child. And there may be other ways in which children can be physically abused. Emotional, mental, or verbal abuse. Name calling, threatening, exposing a child to domestic violence is extremely, extremely harmful to a child. A lack of support or nurturing of a child, exposure to adult conflict. 2 people get divorced and they use the child as a torpedo, extremely harmful. And bullying, of course. Neglect. Neglect is the most common form of child abuse in the United States. Medical neglect, not taking care of a child's medical needs. Most all of the children who come into our child abuse clinic have not had their shots, for example. Failure to thrive, not being fed properly. That happens with some infants particularly. Scholastic neglect is just what it sounds like. Failure to protect a child from another person. Lack of hygiene, lack of clean surroundings can be neglect. Sexual abuse, that's the one we hear most about. Touching a child in an inappropriate place. We say, any place within the bathing suit area, but, there could be other types of sexual touching that don't involve that particular part of the body. Penetration of the body in any way through any orifice of the body. Sexual suggestiveness. We'll talk a little bit about grooming a little bit later on, but making crude sexual jokes with children and so forth, exposing children to adult sexuality, pornography, sex stories and things like that. Exploiting a child. We sometimes have had cases, especially with the opioid epidemic, of people selling their children for drugs. Rape of a child, which happens in just about every child abuse case because children cannot give consent.
Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Barter, and I'm here to talk to you about a subject that may be a bit uncomfortable, but something that we as church people need to talk about, and that is child sex abuse. Let me begin by saying that I have been a forensic psychologist since I began my pre-doctoral fellowship in 2002, and prior to that was a master's level therapist for 8 years, working primarily in child abuse prevention and treatment. And I could no sooner than anyone tell you who is a sex abuser and who is not a sex abuser based purely on demographics, psychological testing, income level, race, ethnicity, occupation, age. Those things just don't predict sex abuse. It is behavior that really tells us whether a person is a sex abuser or not, whether someone abuses children or not. So with that warning in mind, then we all have to be very careful about the issue of sex abuse and how to prevent it, at least to the greatest extent possible in our churches, schools, and other religious institutions. There are 3 categories of sex abusers. One of them would be known as pedophiles. Those groups of people are actually sexually attracted to children, and they use children, images of children, physical contact with children as means of sexual arousal and sexual gratification. That is also known in the field of psychology as a paraphilia. And it's an abnormal sexual attraction. It's not normal for adults and children to have sexual activity, and it's very hard to treat. And in many cases it just simply needs to be regulated, and those are a lot of the folks that we see, for example, on the sex offender registries, where we keep good tabs on where these people are. So that's one category of sex abuser, the pedophile. Another category of sex abuser may be someone who is not a pedophile, not necessarily a bad person at all, but they somehow violate a boundary with a young person. It may not be with a young child, maybe it's with a teenager, but they just exercise really poor judgment. And that person makes a mistake that they may never make again by getting into a poor boundary situation, allowing themselves to be pulled into an unhealthy relationship or unhealthy situation with someone who is a minor or someone in their care. The third category would be the person who's antisocial. Now, the term antisocial is probably one of the greatest misused terms among non-psychology types. People often use the term antisocial to talk about people who are shy or don't like to go out into public. Those people are not antisocial. They are asocial, or they are socially withdrawn. A person who is antisocial in psychological terms is someone who does not conform to society's norms. They are not pro-social. And so the jails and prisons are full of people who are antisocial. And sometimes people have an antisocial attitude that the rules and laws do not apply to them. And so those folks can also be at risk for abusing children physically, sexually, emotionally. Now, when it comes to the safety of children, what's the difference between these 3 groups of sex offenders? And my answer is absolutely nothing. For our purposes of keeping children safe, it doesn't matter whether a person is a pedophile, whether a person is prone to making stupid mistakes, or whether the person has an antisocial personality. The policies that we put in place and the practices that we put in place really should be the same with all people so that we keep our children safe. Since we don't know who sex offenders are in many cases, we just have to be very vigilant, and we cannot make exceptions to our rules about child safety. One really good rule to help you is that it's important to know people. If someone comes to your church and they want to work with youth and you've never met them before, there may be some great enthusiasm because this person's willing to volunteer with your young people. This may be a young person themselves and you think, great, we have somebody to work with our young people. But do you know this person? So it's really good for your church, school, or religious institution to have at least a 6-month policy where they belong to your organization, they worship with you regularly, they get to know your people, and you get to know them for at least 6 months. Get to know them before they get to know your children. Another rule is that you always want to get people to fill out an application if they want to work with youth. And that isn't just for paid staff, but also volunteer staff. You want people to fill out an application that says who they are, where they've lived, who they're in relationship with, and where they've worked with youth before. Have they ever gotten in trouble before in working for a church? Now, they may not even tell you entirely the truth on their application, so you also want to get background checks. Now, background checks should not be family members, they should not be roommates or very close friends, but they should be people with whom these folks have worked or by whom these people have been supervised. People who can give really good background checks. When a person fills out an application to work with young people, you want to be very mindful of things like, are there gaps in employment or gaps in volunteer work? If the person hasn't been involved in youth ministry for a few years, why is that? You want to get answers to questions from people about why they want to work with youth in the first place. There are certainly sample applications that are out there that could help you, but make sure everyone does an application and everyone gets a background check, and please do not make exceptions to these rules, because making exceptions is where we get into trouble. Another question that people ask often, and we run into sometimes in our synod and in our churches, is what if a known registered sex offender wants to join the congregation? And that is something that each congregation is going to have to deal with the mutual ministry committee, with the pastoral team, with the church council, and you may each have different approaches or different ideas about that. But here are some really important things to keep in mind. First of all, there needs to be a disclosure of some kind. If a person is a registered sex offender, the whole purpose of their being registered is that their sex offense is not private. And so they do not have a legitimate expectation of privacy around sexual offending. And so it is perfectly appropriate for you to sit down with that person and say, look, you can join our congregation, but here are the rules. Number one, people need to know that you're a registered sex offender. If they're a registered sex offender, they should understand that. Secondly, there should be a respectful disclosure to the congregation that this person is interested in joining. And third, of course, this person is never to work with young people under the age of 18 in your church, supervised or otherwise, and they should never be on the premises of your church unsupervised or unaccompanied. So, good common sense rules about registered sex offenders. Most registered sex offenders, I would say mostly all, are on the registry for really good reason. It's very rare that someone's on the sex offender registry by mistake. So if they're on the registry, then you definitely want to put these safety policies in place. There are other general child safety policies that we talk about. Never having somebody work alone with children. Always being accompanied by another adult, and that adult not being related to the first adult. That's really important. Other safety concerns are modeling good, safe behavior in front of our children and around our youth programs. But most importantly, remaining vigilant. And I cannot stress enough that we should never make exceptions to our child safety policy, because it's when we make exceptions or when we let our guard down that somebody who is a sex offender could be in our midst. Keep in mind that sex offenders are among the most patient people you will ever meet. Let me repeat that because it's important. Sex offenders are among the most patient people you will ever meet. They will sometimes insert themselves into a situation where there are children. They may groom children for sex offending for a period of 6 months to a year or more. And so to think that a sex offender is going to come into your church and immediately sort of reveal themselves as this unsavory person is unrealistic. A sex offender is probably going to put themselves in a situation where they have access to children, and they're going to be very patient about it. And so that's why we can't even just rely on the 6-month rule to give us entirely the assurance we need that this person is not risky. You need to do the background checks. You need to do the application, check your sex offender registry to make sure that person's not on the registry, and do all of those things, cross the T's, dot the I's, to make sure that children are kept safe. We know that one sex offense against a child is too many. It can destroy a congregation, it can destroy a family, and it can destroy a child. It can cause great trauma to a child, and none of us want that to happen. So we want to be very vigilant. We want to follow the rules, and in that way, we are good, responsible Christians keeping our children safe. Thanks for watching this video.
Let me give you a couple scenarios and see if you think that they're safe or unsafe. So Bobby is a really mature 20-year-old, and he's asked to drive 3 middle school kids to a church-sponsored dance at the neighboring church, and he has a perfect driving record. I would call that unsafe. No church should have a minimum age less than 21, and 25 is actually the preferred age for drivers under church insurance policies. Driving records and license numbers should be on file with the church if someone is going to be driving other people's kids. At a youth event, Pat sits on Chris's lap, and they're obviously affectionate. Everyone at church knows they're dating, so you allow this to occur. Unsafe. These behaviors of physical intimacy just don't belong at a church-sponsored event. They can make people very uncomfortable. During a rainy day activity, small activity groups are formed for breakout sessions, and there's a shortage of teachers. So one group meets in a closed room unsupervised, and you allow this because all the kids in this group are pious little Christians. Pious or not, it's unsafe. Kelly's doing an art project, and when she rolls up her sleeves to wash her hands after finger painting, you notice a lot of bruises. When you ask about them, she says she doesn't know where she got them, where they came from, and you wonder about abuse. So you decide to consult your supervisor, Sunday school superintendent or pastor, to see if a mandated report has to be made. And that's safe. It's the law in every state in the Synod that if you really suspect child abuse, you have to report it. You are a mandated reporter if you're watching this training. A number of members of the congregation have web-enabled phones, and they take pictures of the kids at the Christmas pageant to post on their personal Facebook pages. That is unsafe. Follow your church's photo policy, and if your church doesn't have one, make a lot of noise until they get one. You do not have permission to post these pictures personally. Make sure permission is on file for each child pictured if you're going to put them on the church Facebook page, which is what I would recommend. Abelard is a 25-year-old youth minister, and he's made comments to you about the physical attractiveness of some of the kids. Unsafe. He needs to go, and you document that interaction. You overhear another teacher telling a kid that their answer to a question was stupid. Report this to the church staff. That is safe. You report all of these things to church staff or superiors when you see them happening. In your church, the parents of all children are invited to participate in safety training for children. In fact, you've now opened up the safety training to all adults and youth. That is safe. Your training should be open to everyone. Share this video with millions of people. You're cool. Kids should be able to hear you drop the F-bomb once in a while so they can relate to you. That is unsafe and really dumb. A child tells you, I want to tell you something about my coach at school, but you have to keep it a secret. You agree not to tell anyone for fear that if you do, the child will not disclose anything to you. Don't make that promise. You are a mandated reporter, and studies show that telling the child you can't keep that secret will probably not prevent them from disclosing. You just say to them, my #1 job is to keep you safe. I can't make that promise. They'll probably tell you what they're going to disclose. And by telling you what they've already told you, I think they're making a disclosure. We are mandated reporters. What does that mean? It varies among states. Be familiar with your state's mandated reporting laws. Who is mandated? In all of the New England states, just about everyone who works with youth is mandated. Just about everyone who works with the elderly is mandated. In all the New England states, clergy are mandated. Who is exempted? Very few people. There's a chain of accountability within your church, and so I would not recommend making your own report to the state unless it involves the authority figures in the church. What I would do is go to the pastor or go to the mutual ministry committee and decide how you're going to do that. You are immune from litigation in all of the New England states. It means if you make a report and there's no abuse, they can't turn around and sue you for making the report. And there are penalties for failing to report for some people. If you are a nurse or a doctor, I could lose my license for not making a report. You've got to consult before making a report. Identify an expert in your church or community who could help you with that. And oftentimes we recommend using a worksheet. If you go to most state websites, there are worksheets that you can fill out before you make the report, and it makes that phone call go a lot easier. Let's talk for a minute about bullying. It's sometimes a subtle thing and sometimes not. There's an imbalance of power where a bully takes power away from someone else. It's self-perpetuating. If you let it go on, it's going to go on. It is indifferent and non-empathic. The bully forgets what it feels like. It is unfaithful to what we believe as religious people, and it's unacceptable. Some of the targets of bullying are the body shape and size of others, the sexual orientation or gender identity of others, and people's disabilities or different abilities. Bullying behaviors are physical, verbal, relational, meaning excluding kids from groups, and sexual harassment. Sometimes we encounter with youth cutting behaviors. It's usually related to trauma, maybe some personality pathology, which we won't get into today. It's a learned behavior. Someone taught them to cut at somewhere along the line. At some time, and many times it's more benign than it looks, but it shouldn't be ignored. If someone has cut themselves at a youth gathering or some sort of youth event, it definitely needs to be addressed right away and should not be ignored. Don't panic. If the cutting has been recent, check in with the parent or guardian. You would do that anyway. Don't stigmatize and shame the child. And the vast majority of cutting behaviors go away when the person becomes an adult. It doesn't always go away, but most of the time it does. You should have prevention strategies in your churches by now. If you don't, here are some good ones to follow. And keep in mind that every church is different. A minimum of 2 adults with kids at all times, one 21 or older, the other child might be 18 or older. But in working with youth, you can be really close to the age of the person you're supervising if you're 21. So we say at least 1 adult must have attained the age of 21 and must be at least 4 years older than the oldest youth in the group. No unrelated adult with a youth or child alone at any time, although in small churches particularly that's hard, so you might want to just make sure a second adult is within earshot. Windows on classroom doors or open doors. Never put an adult in a room with kids with doors closed. No unrelated teenager with a younger child alone at any time. Proper age-appropriate restraints in vehicles. That's the law in many of our states. I think all the New England states have restraint laws around children. No drivers under the age of 25. We talked about that. And all adults transporting children should have a driving background check if they're going to do it on a regular basis. All adults who wish to work with children and youth should agree to a background check when requested. And no photographs should be taken without permission. That's called informed consent. No child should participate without parental permission. You want to make sure that you know who to call in an emergency and what the medical situation is for that child. And now we're going to talk about safety for seniors. "30% of mainline American Protestants are over 65. Just 10 years ago, it was 23%. We're getting older. 56% of senior women 54% of senior men report belonging to a church. Senior women are 9% more likely to attend church weekly than senior men. And the most significant predictor of separation of elders from their adult children is a senior apartment. So as opposed to living in the family home in the community, oftentimes when people move into senior apartments, they are isolated from their children. They may be closer to other people that are important in their lives, peers and so forth, but they tend to be isolated from family. What are the types of elder abuse? We know there's physical abuse, physical force resulting in bodily injury or pain. It can involve assault or battery and inappropriate restraint of seniors as well. Sexual abuse, we may not always think this way, but senior citizens and elders can be sexually abused. It's non-consensual sexual contact of any kind. Domestic violence is an escalating pattern of violence by an intimate partner. That exists in the senior community. Psychological abuse is the willful infliction of mental or emotional anguish by threat or humiliation or other verbal or nonverbal conduct. Financial abuse can be very common in some communities, the illegal or improper use of an older person's funds or property or resources. And neglect, failure to take care of a senior, and also self-neglect is a failure to provide for one's own essential needs. Although estimates vary, it's generally believed that 4 to 6% of the elderly are abused. So let's talk about a few scenarios. Financial abuse and exploitation of seniors costs approximately $36.5 billion annually. That's an amazing number. Caroline's an 89-year-old widow and she lives alone. At the coffee hour, you notice she started talking about Kevin, a young man who visits her on a regular basis. Caroline reveals that she met him when he came to sell her some insurance. She has to scoot home now to cook Sunday dinner for Kevin, who's coming over to talk about increasing her coverage. What are your thoughts about that? Think about that. What might the risks be? This may be very innocent. Kevin may be a friend of the family. Kevin may, but we don't know that for sure. But Kevin could also be exploiting her. If you know Caroline's family and you feel, that close enough to them, or if you feel the pastor should call Caroline's family, someone may call and say, do you know who this Kevin guy is and what is he doing? If Caroline has family. And if not, I think you want to listen carefully because that might be a call to Adult Protective, which is the same as a child abuse report. In most states, it's a different telephone number. The survey conducted by the National Association of Geriatric Care Members, Professional Geriatric Care Managers, found that self-neglect among seniors is the most common form of non-financial elderly abuse and neglect encountered by care managers, far outpacing encounters with physical or sexual abuse or neglect. Robert's been coming to church unshaven for some time now, but lately you notice that he evidences poor overall hygiene, and it's evidenced by his odor and the look of his clothes. How would you handle this? Your answer may be different depending on your situation. Your church may have a nurse. You may have access to services if you're a larger church. A smaller church might be in a community that could reach out to him. But be mindful that Robert may be neglecting himself because he just can no longer care. Financial and emotional abuse have the highest prevalence among seniors, but some experience physical abuse. William lives with his adult son. He's missed church for a couple of weeks. Very uncharacteristic for him. He never misses church. And when you call to set up a visit, his son refuses to let you speak to him. The son finally agrees to a visit as long as he's there when you arrive. And when you get there, William has this symmetrical bruising on his face and a broken bridge on his glasses. When you ask him about this, he laughs and tells you that he's clumsy. Is there any reason for concern? Well, I don't know how many forensic folks there are out in the audience or watching this video, but symmetrical bruising is almost impossible to do by accident. We rarely fall perfectly on both sides of our face at the same time. That to me would be a #1 clue that someone has grabbed his face or slapped his face symmetrically to cause the bruising. Caregiver neglect is cited as a major risk factor. So Donna was a regular church attender until she broke her hip. She was forced to go live with her adult daughter. While Tammy works, a roommate, Buddy, cares for Tom. You make a communion visit and Buddy comes to the door, obviously drunk. He explains that Donna is sleeping, but you're welcome to wait until Donna is aroused. Buddy offers you a drink and then makes an inappropriate comment about your appearance. What? What would you do in that situation? Donna doesn't have very good care, and you may want to talk to the daughter first before getting too deeply involved. If you're not the pastor watching this, you might want to talk to the pastor. Who are the abusers? Among seniors, family members account for 60% of abuse, friends and neighbors 25%, and institutional caregivers and case managers 15%. That includes the church. Let's talk a little bit about our spaces, because this involves the church safety for children and seniors particularly. Who has keys to your church? Who's charged with making sure that walking surfaces are safe and clear from debris, snow, and ice? Do bathrooms have grab bars? And if someone falls in the bathroom, how do they get help? Do seniors drive themselves to your church? Do you have parking lot attendants? So this is something that some churches have done, because parking can be a nightmare in any church parking lot. But a church that I know of in the South had a young adult group who greeted the seniors when they came to church and acted like valets and basically parked their cars for them and then went to get their cars when church was over. And it saved a lot of anxiety in the parking lot. How quickly are spills handled? What about rugs and chairs? You know, a rug that looks safe to me may not be safe to somebody on a walker or with a new hip or a new knee, particularly if it's slippery underneath or if there's an edge that can be caught. You only need a half-inch edge on a rug for someone to catch it on their toe, and then you've got an accident. And of course, plenty of lighting is important. We are mandated reporters for seniors as well, so aged, blind, disabled, and medically indigent persons are covered by the Adult Protective Services Act. You just have to have reasonable cause to suspect abuse, neglect, or exploitation, past, present, or potential, and it must be reported by mandated reporters. All church clergy, staff, and volunteers are mandated reporters in all of the New England states. Any church member voluntarily driving a covered person to church is a mandated reporter, and it is best not to investigate. It's just best not to report alone. If you suspect some sort of abuse or neglect, talk to somebody. That ends the presentation. Here's my contact information if you have further questions. You can call the phone number that's on the screen, or send a fax, or send an email to wbarter@outlook.com. You can also get hold of me by emailing or calling the New England Synod House, and they will pass the message along to me. I hope this video has been informative to you, and I hope you take this stuff to heart and continue your education in ways that we as a church can be safe and safe places for ourselves and for our seniors and children. Thank you.